Hey everyone, hope you're still hanging in there during quarantine and staying safe and staying healthy. It's been a pretty intense week, I think, for a lot of us, definitely for me as well. And um, it's been a pretty intense week politically as we've seen the Senate move forward with a stimulus bill to the tune of $2 trillion. And a huge question that a lot of people have been asking and that the political system has sought to resolve is who is going to be the beneficiary of those funds? And what kind of a world and a new type of system might those funds go towards building? And I think that's really relevant to what we're going to be talking about today as we this week unpack some of the issues around the regulatory apparatus in the United States with respect to environmental issues and how decisions around what priorities the state's agencies have, how those decisions get made. So far in class, we've covered a bunch of different issues. We've talked about biodiversity and biodiversity loss. We've spent time talking about energy science and energy policy. We've talked about climate change, the basic science, the policy options, and the potential impacts. And this week, we are pivoting to talk about pollution, pesticides, and regulation, a little bit removed from climate change in particular, which has been the focus of the class thus far. And given all of the attention that climate change tends to occupy in environmental studies, in environmental policy in particular, I think it's important to take stock of how issues around pollution and contamination play a role in shaping public opinion, building public constituencies, and ultimately making policy that can be relevant for environmental issues of all different types. And in particular, if we ask ourselves, which of these issues concerns us the most, which seem the most or least tractable to address, and which do we feel most immediately, we might actually have different responses to those questions. Biodiversity is something that people tend to value. We talked about why we value biodiversity and what can be done to address issues of biodiversity loss. Climate change and climate policy and the politics of energy, as we've discussed over the last couple of weeks, have some solutions and a pathway towards a zero carbon future that we can identify, but politically it's incredibly challenging to deal with. At the same time, while people care about climate change and everyone wants and needs a habitable planet for the future, climate change can feel a little abstract. It can feel far away. Pollution and regulation, I think, on the other hand, are really immediately felt. And as a result of that, it's been really crucial in the history of building the environmental movement as we know it today and in shaping environmental policy. So the purpose of this week is to understand a little bit about the basics of environmental regulation in the United States. Paul Valianatos' book that you are reading has a lot to say about the EPA in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about the EPA. And in discussion, we'll talk about not only the reasons that some of its failings have kind of unfolded the way they have over the last several decades, but also what type of alternatives can we imagine that could be more productive and more effective at fulfilling the laudable mandate that the EPA was founded with. We're also going to try to think about what success stories with respect to regulation can look like. And as a political ecologist, I always circle back to how power gets wielded and used by people who are affected the most by these things. And one of the things that I also have been coming back to as I've been rereading this book, thinking about the world this week, coming on the heels of revisiting Naomi Klein, is another book that Naomi Klein wrote a little while back. And maybe some of you watched the Democracy Now! Video that I sent around a few days ago, where they talked about the impacts of coronavirus on policymaking and kind of the types of responses that we might expect. And it's really connected to something that Naomi Klein previously called the shock doctrine. And what the shock doctrine refers to is the idea that when major disasters hit, and they can be economic disasters or environmental disasters, oftentimes powerful interests will use the cover of those events to pass policies that further their power, that further their wealth. And we're seeing, I think, that manifest right now. We're seeing it manifest in the form of debates over what the stimulus package should consist of. We're seeing that unfold on the floor of the House and the Senate in the form of debates over whether or not we should have large bailouts for fossil fuel industries or expanded pay and unemployment benefits for people that are losing jobs as a result of the coronavirus. And the path that we end up taking is going to have huge consequences going forward. Whether we end up propping up industries that are unsustainable with resources, industries that are declining, whose vulnerability is being revealed by the current pandemic, or whether we try to address other structural issues, lack of access to healthcare, the need to transform the economy through a Green New Deal, for example, is going to be a really key tipping point going forward. And we're really in a moment of pretty serious kind of crossroads and divergence of what possible futures we might have. And I know that this is a moment where we might feel pretty isolated, being in quarantine and all, and yet I think it's really important to stay engaged in some way because our voices really do matter at this moment. We really are at an important kind of crossroads right now. And there's several examples of things that have happened just now in the last, couple of years and in the last couple of weeks that I think are worth looking at too. So citing the outbreak recently, I think this was from March 27th, so just a couple of days ago, depending on when you're watching this, citing an outbreak, the EPA has stopped enforcing environmental laws. And this is one type of response that I think kind of falls under that category of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. Basically, in the context of increased costs of doing business, more precarious profits as economic activity has stalled, the argument that they advanced in the EPA is that it would be unacceptably cumbersome for companies to comply with basic environmental regulations. And as a result, they're looking to suspend them. They've suspended them. It's a sweeping decision that forgoes fines or other civil penalties for companies that have failed to monitor, report, or meet some of the other requirements that they might have for releasing hazardous pollutants. Very much aligned, I think, with some of the stuff that Valianatos talks about, but perhaps an even further kind of manifestation of it, where at least in the short run, the EPA has dropped even the pretense of fulfilling its mandate to protect people from pollution, from environmental hazards, and protect environmental health, right? And at the micro level, I think that we all deal with some of the consequences of this cracked regulatory apparatus. While you're on quarantine, you might be drinking LaCroix. It's a thing that people consume a lot of that's supposed to be regulated. And this video describes a little bit about some of the issues with that Wired put out. And I thought it was interesting because it's a product that has proliferated a lot recently and has also attracted attention because of issues related to regulation. So let's see if this works.
LaCroix. Fizzy, cold, refreshing, and incredibly addicting. It starts with just one can a day, and then before you know it, this happens. You're not alone either. Sales of LaCroix have more than tripled in the past few years. But hey, what's the harm? After all, it's just water, right? It says right here, naturally flavored, with no sweeteners, no calories, no artificial anything. But if you're drinking a pack a day, you gotta wonder, what the hell is natural flavor? And could this stuff actually be bad for you? According to the FDA, natural flavor can be anything a company uses to add flavor to a product, so long as it comes directly from a natural source. But there is a catch. Even if, for example, a certain grapefruit flavor is extracted directly from grapefruits, companies can still mix in synthetic additives, like solvents, to make that flavor blend well with the other ingredients. The FDA calls these ingredients incidental additives. And thanks to a lack of policy governing their use, food makers are not required to disclose what they are or when they're in a product.
When a consumer sees natural flavors on an ingredient label, that does not necessarily mean that the product or the food is free of synthetic ingredients. In higher concentrations, we definitely know that some of these can be harmful. The question would be at what levels they're found in foods.
So we asked National Beverage if they use any incidental additives in their product, LaCroix. And, no surprise, they claim that there is nothing artificial in the drink. Of course, we have to take this claim at face value because they're not required to tell us how they extract those flavors.
There's two different issues. One is the lack of transparency and not knowing exactly what's being added to a product. The other concern would be that the use of these flavors are making foods that may not be as healthy for you as your body thinks.
Even if there's nothing artificial added, there could still be naturally derived additives that could be harmful if you drink too much of them. Unlikely? Yes, but there's no way to know for sure. And there's still one more concern for LaCroix fanatics: all those bubbles. So we asked a dentist, is carbonation bad for your teeth?
Sparkling water is carbon dioxide dissolved in water, which forms carbonic acid. When you drink a carbonated beverage, that natural fluid in the mouth neutralizes the carbonic acid, and there's very little damage likely to occur.
How should you celebrate that bit of good news? With some bubbly, of course, but as always, drink responsibly.
All right, so we'll see how that worked as far as like broadcasting in a streamed video. If it didn't work, I'll post the link and you can just watch that video yourself, the audio and so on, and stream quality. I'm not really sure how that worked. But the main point here is that you can already see some of the things that Valianatos talked about.
Always.
Oops, coming to a head there. Oops. The fact that there's certain compounds in LaCroix that are classified in such a way so as to not subject them to extensive regulatory oversight by the FDA in this case, echoes some of the things that we're going to cover a little bit more that we've read about as well, around distinctions that seem sort of technical between, say, active ingredients and inert compounds that are in, say, pesticides, but also potentially in other things. In fact, can be really political decisions. It behooves a company to declare various ingredients to be inert or inactive in such a way as to exclude them from being rigorously studied. And of course, there's other issues with rigorously studying and testing these compounds and the things that we're putting into our body because labs have closed so much over time. Another example that's been grabbing a lot of headlines, that's been attracting a lot of attention recently, is Juul vaping. It's caught on a lot. There's been regulations at the state level to prevent its proliferation. And also the reasons that Juul has avoided certain types of oversight, although that kind of caught up with it in some places eventually, is kind of complicated, right? Because on the one hand, it was initially perhaps threatening to the pretty large, well-funded, well-lobbied for tobacco industry. But I understand that recently, Juul has actually been bought by Big Tobacco. So whose interest is it in to actually support rigorous testing now? Well, that's kind of an open question. But there's good reasons to think that it's not really in the interest of a lot of folks who might stand to be making money off of this product, right? Okay, so I'm just going to provide a little bit of background on the kind of context in which the EPA and other environmental governance and law operates. And some of this will be familiar, but it's worth situating it because I think that the kind of contours of how regulation works in the United States is good to keep in mind as you think about how environmental regulation and policy can function, and also how the EPA sort of fits into all of that. So in the United States, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In a federal system that we have with the supremacy clause of the Constitution, we have sort of an order of different types of law that supersede others. The Constitution is kind of the final law of the land, although it's, and this is critical, subject to judicial interpretation. We have a precedent in the United States of courts being able to interpret laws and set precedents for how those laws are interpreted that can apply down the line, which makes the judicial branch very powerful. But ultimately, there's other things that kind of come below that. So there's acts of Congress, there's treaties, which are especially important for international environmental law. There's a whole suite of federal administrative regulations that apply to and are formed by the executive branch. And then because we have a federal system, states actually have a decent amount of power over various types of regulations. And within states, there's constitutions, laws and statutes, and also, again, administrative regulations. And then there's also city and county ordinances that can apply to various types of regulations, including environmental regulations. but they must be in accordance with state law. And depending on where you are, the process for passing municipal ordinances can actually be subject directly to oversight by the state. Certain types of ordinances in Massachusetts, for example, must actually be approved by the state legislature. So oftentimes what will happen is, in Massachusetts, towns will try to get things done via codes and other things that don't require as much oversight by the state, because that can be seen as sort of cumbersome. But ultimately, this is kind of the order of operations within the United States. And another important kind of point that undergirds all of what Paul Valianatos talks about in his book is just the basic structure of the US government, right? So we've got the Congress, the legislative branch, which passes laws. We've got the executive branch, which enforces laws, but also crucially, it controls administrative agencies that issue permits and set agency rules. And agencies actually have their own quasi-judicial processes where a lot of environmental law takes place in practice. And this is really crucial, because what that means is that whoever's in charge of the executive branch can populate the regulatory agencies essentially according to their political interests, right? And a lot of environmental adjudication, or a lot of environmental regulation happens with the oversight only of those folks that are appointed by the administration itself. The judiciary also plays an important role in this, like I mentioned a second ago. And at the state level, this whole process is kind of mirrored, essentially. So state governments have the same general framework. Powers are split between legislative, executive, and judicial branches. But also some states have stronger environmental protections in their constitutions than others. So this is an excerpt from the Pennsylvania Constitution, for example. The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of the people. So this is a pretty bold statement in the Constitution. It enshrines legally and kind of the supreme law of the state, superseded only by federal law and the federal Constitution, not only kind of economic value and instrumental values of nature, but also scenic, historic, and aesthetic value. It not only enshrines the rights of people that exist, but also the rights of future generations. And if meaningful legal protections are genuinely afforded to all of those groups, we can imagine that that could be potentially really powerful. At the same time, that kind of language is ultimately only as good as the statutes, the statutory law and regulations on the ground that are passed to implement them, that breathe meaning into this lofty and aspirational language. And as you might have ascertained from what you've read so far, oftentimes some of this great language doesn't really match with the reality of what regulations do. So just another wall of text before I stop showing walls of text, which I'm generally opposed to in these types of presentations. Now, there might be a couple more, that might be a lie. But there's a ton of different agencies at the federal level that are responsible for different types of environmental regulation. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, because it underscores the fact that environmental governance and regulation is pretty complicated. Valianatos writes about the EPA, but what you can see here just based on this list is that the EPA is actually only one of many agencies that have relevant powers and responsibilities and jurisdictional oversight for environmental policy. You've got the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Energy, Health and Human Services, Interior, a huge one, Justice, Transportation, the EPA, of course, NASA, the NSF, Nuclear Regulation, U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. FERC is actually an interesting one. That's kind of a lesser known but really important agency that if you're trying to, for example, change who owns the grid and maybe municipalize a private utility so that it has so it's controlled democratically by people in a municipality, something that Naomi Klein advocated for, FERC is actually going to be a really important player that you're going to have to engage with, right? And this is not unique or endemic to the United States. A lot of different places have similar situations where there's many different agencies that have relevant powers and responsibilities related to the environment. But this does produce problems of coordination and perhaps more importantly, political ramifications, because some of the sort of procedural complexity that's introduced by this institutional morass can sometimes provide cover for those with the resources to navigate this kind of bureaucracy for activities that are often transparently counter to the sort of the spirit of regulation, counter to the spirit of the type of language that we see in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And one example that I heard from reading a book by a lawyer named Mary Wood was that the Columbia River Basin salmon production is kind of a really good example of how a single species, a single type of regulation can actually pass through a large number of these different agencies. And again, remember that this list here is only the federal level, so it doesn't even account for the state and local levels. But to protect the fish, to paraphrase Mary Wood, environmental law needs to protect the species' full life cycle journey from gravel to gravel for the salmon, which includes inland watersheds, going out to the ocean, and then returning to the place that they initially were born to spawn again. And any sort of ecological or regulatory weak link in this ecology could doom the species. But different agencies have different powers over different parts of this ecological system. And this one professor, Charles Wilkinson, actually mapped out the jurisdictional domain of salmon law and determined that a salmon trying to return from the ocean to its natural waters in the Lochsa River of Idaho would swim through 17 separate jurisdictions, all of which try to coordinate with each other, but without any obvious success for the species' recovery. Wood writes that an agency roll call in the Columbia Basin displays the dizzying complexity of typical environmental bureaucracy. The states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, as well as the fishing tribes, all set harvest quotas. The Pacific Fishery Management Council controls ocean harvest. The Bureau of Land Management oversees the rangeland that holds key riparian areas for salmon spawning. The Forest Service manages the timbered headwaters that support other vital spawning areas. The Army Corps of Engineers operates dams. It goes on and on and on, right? So many, many different states, local agencies, et cetera, all have some kind of a role to play here. In this case, the federal EPA and state agencies regulate toxins, heavy metals, and pesticides that might spill from industrial pipes into salmon habitat, right? And amid this complexity, you actually get into issues where different agencies might have competing mandates, right? The EPA really might be focused on regulating pollution. Another agency might be focused on maximizing sustainable fish harvest. Yet another agency might be tasked with preserving ecosystems around where the salmon are spawning and migrating, right? So these could be very different missions that have different implications for what types of policies are ultimately carried out. So another kind of deeper issue, and this I think also is behind a lot of what Valianatos talks about, is that with a few exceptions, statutes authorize agencies to issue permits to damage nature. Such discretion rests on a presumption that agencies remain expert bodies that unfailingly exercise their judgment objectively for the good of the public and in accordance with protective statutory goals. That presumption now collides with reality. And I think what this is really getting at here is the fact that agencies that regulate tend to frame their regulation in the context of providing permits for companies to do damage, rather than having stricter kind of a stricter baseline of non-harm and non-pollution being sort of the norm. So the frame kind of puts the onus on ecosystems, on nature, on constituencies for environmental health and environmental protection to make the case that company activities are problematic. So how did this all kind of come to be? Well, one of the biggest themes that Valianatos talks about that I really want to get across today is this idea of regulatory capture. And regulatory capture is defined as a form of political corruption that occurs when a regulatory agency created to act in the public interest instead advances the commercial or special concerns of interest groups that dominate the industry or the sector that it is charged with regulating. So keep that in mind. And we're going to turn now just to talking a little bit about the basics of pesticide use and why pesticides in particular have been such an important site where the rubber meets the road with environmental policy, regulation, and really conflict ultimately. So this map shows annual pesticide consumption worldwide. You can sort of see the general big picture breakdown. The United States consumes quite a lot of pesticides. China consumes a lot more. Countries that are pretty populous tend to consume a lot of it. Brazil, India. You can see sort of the geographic distribution here. But the point is that pesticides are pretty ubiquitous. They're a almost universal feature of agriculture across the world, especially kind of big scale cash crop production, and a lot of the crops that we depend on for diets, especially in urban areas where people are far away from subsistence lifestyles, both in time and also in space. So pesticide use has not always been this widespread or this kind of severe and as intense. So this graph right here shows how pesticide use has grown over time, and it's pretty striking. So you can see that from 1990 to, I think this is from 2012, maybe, yeah, it says 2012. Argentina saw an increase of 815%, an eightfold increase, more than an eightfold increase, nearly a fivefold increase in Bangladesh, fourfold in Thailand, threefold in Brazil, et cetera, right? And this is only showing countries that use over 20 million kilograms of pesticides annually, which is a quantity that's kind of hard to fathom. But you can imagine then that with these global trends, pesticide use has increased a lot in a relatively short amount of time. And given what we know about some of the weaknesses of the regulatory apparatus that Valianatos talks about, the fact that labs have been cut in places like the United States, the fact that certain compounds that are in pesticides have been classified in such a way as to virtually exempt them from the legal remit of regulatory agencies, that there's a lot of consequences of this massive uptick in pesticide use that we don't even know about yet, that we can't even know about yet. Long-lasting health consequences and environmental consequences as well. And we'll talk about some of those details in just a second here. All right, so what kinds of consequences does pesticide use have? Well, this here shows that there are chromosomal aberrations, genotoxicity, that is damage to your genome, literally damage to DNA, which can have a bunch of different consequences in terms of what kinds of proteins your body is producing. And a lot of health consequences can emerge from the genotoxicity of pesticides. There's also pollution consequences of not just pesticides, but other types of unregulated production from industry, right? So when we move beyond pesticides, we see a host of other consequences from particulates and other environmental pollutants that industries are producing. According to the WHO, 7 million people die prematurely every year from air pollution, both household pollution and outdoor pollution. This includes 21% that are due to pneumonia, 20% from stroke, 34% from heart disease, with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease at 20% and 7% from lung cancer as the overall breakdown of those 7 million. And there's reasons to think that this could be an underestimate because it's really hard to establish a causal link, a clear causal connection between environmental pollutants and health outcomes. If someone dies of heart disease or lung cancer or pneumonia, it can be really difficult to say conclusively that that person contracted the condition that ultimately killed them as a result of environmental pollutants, which makes it hard to make these estimates in the first place, but there are methods that the WHO and other epidemiologists use to try to estimate them. And I think right now, in the context of the coronavirus, with risk to pulmonary disease, that can be really, really scary. These consequences hold perhaps even a special or elevated concern for a lot of us, certainly for me. I have asthma, and as a result of that, I'm personally, at higher risk as a result of the coronavirus. And I know a lot of other people that are in a similar situation. Asthma is another thing that is linked to environmental pollutants, right? Things that people don't really have control over that are also disproportionately distributed. All right, so just a couple other facts here. Where does pollution come from? According to the WHO, power plants and industry are the biggest source of these types of pollutants. Transportation and wildfire smoke constitute other important sources. Oops. Sorry, I just paused there for a second. Hopefully this is back on. But like I said a minute ago, particulates and pollution, and also pesticides, are not distributed uniformly. Their consequences are not generated uniformly either. And that has really important consequences, both in terms of how we understand the problem, how we think about its consequences, how it connects to other forms of oppression, and what the solutions might actually be and what they have been historically. So this photo right here shows the Fisk Generating Station in Chicago. And there's a really interesting story connected to this plant that I'll circle back to in a little bit. But part of why I include this is because this is located in a primarily Hispanic neighborhood in Chicago, mirroring bigger global trend or bigger national trends in the United States around where polluting facilities are sited. African-American communities in particular have been a major, have been disproportionately exposed to polluting facilities for a really long time. And the environmental justice movement, which really focused on environmental racism, emerged from a growing understanding that the burdens of pollution, the burdens of toxicity, the burdens of a failing regulatory apparatus are not equitably distributed. In fact, they are very much distributed along the lines of race, along the lines of class. And as a result of that, specific solutions and responses are called for. Specific issues from the failures of environmental regulation of the sort that Valianatos points out take on an even greater sort of dimension in terms of how unjust they are and the vile social ideologies that kind of undergird them. So environmental racism is nothing new. This is an infographic from The Nation that I think is useful. It points out that race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil in the United States. 56% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color. People of color have 38% higher nitrogen dioxide exposure, which is a pollutant with respiratory consequences, are twice as likely to live without potable water and modern sanitation, and have seen 95% of their claims against polluters denied by the EPA, which is, it doesn't have the statistic here, but it's higher than it would be for white folks. And the city that I'm from, Chicago, is a place that has a lot of environmental injustice going on here. So this is a map that kind of shows public health outcomes of a certain type of in the form of cancer rates on the left. And what you can see is that rates are higher in certain parts of the city than they are in others. And on the right, hopefully you can see this with the resolution the way it is, you can see the racial distribution, the racial demography of Chicago. And what you can see is that there's a pretty strong overlap, a pretty obvious visible overlap in terms of the prevalence of cancers and where Black and brown folks live, and especially Black folks in Chicago. And the other thing that you can see on the map to the left is so-called industrial corridors, where a lot of polluting facilities have been over time. These are places that have been criminalized, places that had a lot of pollution from industry, both in the past and still today. And these are also places that, due to a lot of different types of housing policies over the past 60 or 70, 80 now years almost, and before that too, had led to racialized segregation in the city of Chicago. And these are patterns that you can see elsewhere in the United States as well, that are really pretty ubiquitous across cities in the US. All right. So there's been a lot of scholarship on trying to understand the nature of these unequal distributions of burdens from environmental pollution and also their causes. And one of the big kind of questions that often comes up is the degree to which class and race intersect. And in the environmental justice scholarship, there's been a lot of attention to trying to suss out these details. And this paragraph right here from a really good, very rigorous paper on the subject kind of spells out how we know what we know about how things are distributed. And basically analyzing a bunch of different studies, these two scholars, Mohai and Bryant, found that race was, in many of the studies, a more important predictor than income of where environmental hazards are located. They found in some other studies that both race and class were significant determinants of proximity to known and prospective environmental hazards. And they found that significant relationships exist between ethnic and class characteristics of a community and the levels of exposure that they might face to environmental risk. All right. So overall, there is ubiquitous evidence of environmental inequalities based on race, even when you can control for class. And there's a variety of different ways that that can kind of unfold and reasons that that can be maintained. Part of it has to do with economic resources. Part of it has to do with racist housing policies that cause the sort of segregation, the highly segregated social demography that we see in cities today. And part of it has to do with access to political power and how racialized that is. All right. So what is so bad about pesticides? What do other types of pollutants do? So Valianatos focuses a lot on pesticides because the EPA has in particular played a pretty big role in regulating pesticides in the past. And pesticides have a lot of consequences for human health and for other for the environment, for ecological, for ecosystem services and for ecology. So this chart right here shows some of the consequences of, some of the consequences. I'm not sure if you can see this bar up at the top here. I don't want you to, but I can't seem to get rid of it. Sorry about that. So different types of pesticides have different consequences. But overall, we see a lot of different issues for individuals of different types of species across categories of vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and also invertebrates and even plants and fungi. See disruptions to their brains, to their nervous systems, to their endocrine systems, to their metabolism, their ability to develop, their ability to grow. This can cause population declines. This can contribute to extinctions and declines in biodiversity. And it can also affect communities and ecosystems too, because as species decline, their role in the ecosystem is also compromised. So it has really cascading consequences for ecosystems, both terrestrial and also marine, because a lot of these pesticides ultimately end up in water systems, right? So given the human health, given these environmental health kind of consequences, alongside a bunch of human health consequences, who is really the coalition for pesticides, and who might actually be in a position to oppose it? Clearly, these types of issues are about ecosystems. They're about environmental services, as we know because we've studied it in this class. Environmental services are in turn really important for people, right? And public health, of course, is a concern for people that are affected directly by it. So if we think back to how the politics of regulation might work, who might be able to, or who would be likely to do what in order to oppose or regulate pesticides? Well, there's a history to this, and there's a history in the United States. There's also a global history. So this photo right here depicts a situation in Hawaii where there was just tremendous ecological impacts from pesticide use on pineapple farms. And what happened here was essentially the EPA failed to regulate this entirely. There was huge ecological impacts for endemic species and also human health impacts. Farmers themselves, according to some of the analyses of this situation, were on board with using more pesticides because it seemed profitable. But Valianatos and Jenkins describe farmers as quote unquote cogs in the system, right? As people that don't really have a lot of agency in this. So what would it take potentially for farmers to support more sustainable practices? Valianatos ends the book by talking about the value and importance of smaller scale farming and the degree to which large farming is really caught up and tied up in an industrial pesticide economy. Pesticides cost a lot of money in terms of public health, wildlife loss, crop loss, and groundwater contamination, and yet we still have a large constituency that seems to support them. It's a group that includes international business and government agencies that support them, but also it might include farmers, and large farmers in particular. So one story that I came across not too long ago that I think provides an interesting alternative of what a coalition that might oppose pesticide or profligate and unregulated pesticide use might look like. And in Costa Rica, what happened over the past, mainly in the 90s, is that for kind of the first time in Costa Rica's history up to that point, environmentalists, national and international environmentalists who are concerned about the ecological effects of pesticides, Costa Rica is a very biodiverse place, actually linked up with workers who were starting to see the effects of pesticides on their health. And as a coalition, working with churches and even eventually landholders who were brought around, they managed to unite around concerns for the environment and concerns for public health, and concerns for workers' health especially, in order to demand more regulation successfully. So this is an example of what kind of political power was necessary in order to make kind of a positive change. And similarly, in the United States, there is a strong history of movements really driving environmental regulation. So this is a depiction of the United Farm Workers, which was a multiracial coalition of farmers starting in California that in the 1960s was organized between two different organizations that were led by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, two of the main kind of organizers of United Farm Workers. And they were also big figures in the civil rights movement. And they formed out of a merger of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee and the National Farm Workers Association. And as a result of several strikes in 1965, when mostly Filipino farm workers went on strike, largely Hispanic farm workers elsewhere organized and went on strike in solidarity with them. And part of what they were talking about at the time and what they continued to organize around before wasn't just wages and working conditions on the ground, but also pesticides and environmental issues kind of for the first time. So what we saw as a result of issues around pollution, issues around pesticides, was a merger of the interests of working people, especially farm workers, and environmentalists who were concerned about ecosystem health. And this was kind of a first in a lot of ways in terms of movements really bringing these two concerns that had not historically been seen as joint together. And again, you have to remember that there's different types of strategies and tactics that movements use in order to affect the agendas that they're trying to affect. And in this case, the United Farm Workers used strikes and protests along with boycotts. So what they did is they sought solidarity from consumers, middle-class consumers, upper middle-class consumers, using media and public narrative crafting to build sympathy, to get people to stop buying products that were coming from a value chain that was environmentally and socially and damaging to human health. So this is really a big moment in the history of kind of the environmental movement in the United States as it relates to labor and working people's movements as well. And I think that's really important today still. The West Virginia coal miners, while not explicitly focused on the pollution of the coal industry, were responding to the fact that the West Virginia teachers strike, were responding to the fact that they had seen cuts to their own health care. Once again, kind of uniting different issues that may not have traditionally been seen as the province of environmentalism. Okay, so pesticide pollution from agricultural production is also not distributed equitably at the global level. So the populations that are at risk, as you can see, tend to be most striking in different parts of the global south. And a lot of that has to do with the types of crops that get produced that have a lot of labor intensivity, where people really have to be on the ground doing harvests, planting, etc., and the types of pesticides that are used for them, right? Pesticides have a lot of human health consequences, including endocrine disruption. This is a graph that shows the mean age at first menstruation in France declining over time. Pesticides are thought to play a role in that. Sorry, I'm moving my face all over the place here. And this has other types of consequences as well for immune function, thyroid disorders, neurodevelopment in children, hormone-related cancers, metabolic disorders, and also reproductive health. Developmental issues are also really common. Humans that are, people that are pregnant that are exposed to pesticides can have big issues with their babies. Their babies can have lots of different genetic issues, epigenetic issues, and ultimately developmental issues. Skin problems as well can result from pesticide exposure. And again, pesticides don't just stay in one place. They don't just stay on the ground where they're sprayed. They move throughout the ecosystem. They are transported regionally through the atmosphere. They can get into the air. They can move through water droplets in the air. And they can run off into ocean systems and into riparian systems. They can also penetrate through leaching down into groundwater. There's massive contamination of watersheds like the Ogallala Aquifer, for example, in Oklahoma in the Midwest, that have resulted from this as well. Another consequence is that this can affect genetic diversity, and it can make it harder to adapt to changing environments. As we use pesticides for big monoculture production, we end up limiting the diversity of our agricultural production systems. Pesticides are not uniquely responsible for that, but they are ultimately part of a system that doesn't diversify production, but instead consolidates it into single crops that are implicated in a lot of these kind of ecological consequences that have huge energy inputs and contribute to climate change, and also don't tend to provide tremendously diverse and nutritious food. Okay. All right, so in the context of environmental health starting to get connected to environmental conservation, we started to see a new moment in the history of the environmental movement in the United States. And one of the sort of seminal moments was the publication in the 60s of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which documented the consequences of pesticides on ecology, but it also made people really concerned about the impacts of pesticides on human health. And throughout the 60s, as other types of social movements were also pretty active, all of a sudden, environmentalism and the environmental movement, which was concerned about human health, started to seem like a relatively politically benign force, even to those that were in power and may have been opposed to it. Given that the civil rights movement was going on at this time, which was highly confrontational and oppositional, given that opposition to the Vietnam War was happening, that was extremely threatening to power. Environmentalism was actually a movement that folks like Richard Nixon felt that they could actually accommodate with relative ease. And this led to a variety of different events. So the Environmental Protection Agency was founded in 1970, and part of the kind of series of events that led to this and a bunch of other legislation that came around this time was the first Earth Day in April 1970, when 20 million people across America took to the streets as part of the Earth Day protest. And they were demanding, policy to deal with environmental contamination and to deal with the consequences of unregulated industry for the environment, and also, importantly, for human health. Human health was now forever going to be a major part of how environmentalists delivered their messaging. So in response, the US Congress actually passed a bold suite of major federal environmental statutes. This included the Clean Air Act, which demanded a 90% reduction in car emissions of hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide by 1975. The Clean Water Act was renewed and updated to set a national goal to eliminate all pollution to navigable waters by 1985, another very bold aspiration. The National Forest Management Act demanded sustainable management of public forests and an end to wanton clearcutting. And the Endangered Species Act called for the recovery of imperiled species. So there was a whole lot of regulations that were passed along with the formation of the EPA in the 1970s. And these regulations and laws were really structural. They were kind of sweeping. They had pretty big impacts in terms of what was allowed and what wasn't, with the federal government for the first time taking on environmental regulation explicitly as part of its mandate. And this is where the story that Valianatos starts to tell really starts to emerge. And what he talks about is an agency that had an important, laudable mandate, that had people that were coming out of a movement that were actually pretty excited to implement that mandate. But nevertheless, right out of the gate, an awful lot of forces from industry that were pushing against the truly sort of regulatory and public service mission that the EPA had. It started out with a budget of about 5,000 employees who were pretty enthusiastic. But ultimately, there was, beneath the surface of this, as Valianatos talks about, industry and government still working together to make sure that the regulatory powers of the EPA were curtailed in important ways. That distinctions in terms of what they could regulate were limited in important ways. And one of the big examples that Valianatos talks about is the distinction between inert and active ingredients. What does this distinction mean? Well, once again, this is a seemingly technical distinction between different types of compounds that you might find in a pesticide, but in fact, it's deeply political. And one of the biggest kind of emblematic examples of this is Agent Orange, which was a pesticide, an herbicide that was sprayed widely in Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia that contains dioxins and has not only devastating consequences for the environment by killing plants and making land unsafe for humans and unsafe for agriculture for a really long time, but it also has terrible human consequences and had dramatic, really horrifying effects on humans. The next slide has some disturbing images on it from a museum in Ho Chi Minh City. If you don't want to look at that, fast forward 20 seconds or so, but I do think it's important to be aware of the human consequences of US foreign policy as it relates to people that have been affected by the policies that our government has enacted over the past decades. So this is an image, a horrifying image of what Agent Orange has done to people in Vietnam. And as a result of some of that, there was eventually some movement towards regulation. But that regulation, even when there was so much evidence that the consequences of these chemicals was so dire, were so horrible, continued to be met with staunch resistance from industry. A New York Times report in 1983 shows that Dow discontinued production shortly after the federal ban was imposed in 1979. But a Dow spokesperson, Terry Witt, said the company had no intention of resuming the production of the herbicide, but it had still continued to sell product from inventories previously accumulated. So even after the consequences of these of various chemicals that were implicated in pretty severe human and environmental impacts were kind of made public, they continued to be sold. And eventually, what they said is that because of a public concern and public misinformation, a resolution of the use of the compound as an herbicide was not practical to accomplish. It had gone beyond scientific resolution into the emotional and public anxiety arena. The implication being, of course, that an unreasonable sort of panic in the public was responsible for this. But in fact, there was really rigorous science and human experience that undergirded very well-reasoned resistance to the use of these products. Dow also said that it had spent more than $10 million to defend the product in hearings before the Environmental Agency and in discussions with officials. So this is one sort of jarring example of how industry has interfaced with regulation and with the public. And Valianatos' book is rife with these types of examples. How does all this happen? Well, this really goes back to the notion of regulatory capture. And there's a few quotes here that I think are really, really telling that I want to highlight. The EPA routinely does just about everything based not on health risks, but on the basis of dollars and cents. It nearly always weighs the costs of protecting people and the natural world against the benefits that unregulated pollution brings to businessmen and manufacturers. Illness costs are not factored into assessments. And it's interesting, I think, right now with the coronavirus, that there's a lot of parallels here. We're seeing, for example, $800 billion put on the table to bail out lost profits from shale gas and shale oil extraction industries, even when people are at massive risk from a pandemic, when people are out of work and need relief. We nevertheless are weighing the consequences of a lockdown as a matter of public policy against falling stock prices, perhaps more so than we are against the potential human costs of life and health. With respect to the EPA, another thing that really gets highlighted by Valianatos is that the core function of the EPA was compromised right out of the gate, suggesting that labs are the eyes of the responsible regulator, that having well-funded and well-staffed laboratories is absolutely critical for the EPA to be able to perform its function. And what ended up happening is, even in the 70s, labs started to close down. They started to get funding cut to them. Even as chemicals were rolling out from research and development towards the market, the capacity to test them and to make sure that they were compliant with regulations was getting eroded. And by the 1970s, Valianatos says the pesticide salesman had no natural enemy in the agribusiness jungle. So regulatory capture is what lies behind this. And another specific phenomenon that Valianatos highlights is the revolving door. So the revolving door refers to the phenomenon in which regulators are essentially former industry people, and oftentimes vice versa, where people move seamlessly from top senior positions in regulatory agencies to the industries that they're supposed to be regulating. and back and forth like that, taking their interests and their sensibilities and their ideas with them, right? So this happens this happens across sectors, and it's a major issue. It happens, for example, in the finance sector. This is a graph right here, a series of Venn diagrams showing how this phenomenon plays out. But this just shows how Goldman Sachs, in particular, just one firm, has had senior representation in public administrations over time. And it's not just a recent phenomenon that began with Donald Trump, but something that goes back a lot further. Through Clinton, Bush, Obama, there was tremendous representation of a sector that's supposed to be regulated by the government in the government itself. Same thing with the communications sector. The FCC has seen senior executives go from the FCC itself to industry, right? And what that means is that when you're in the regulatory position, if you're ultimately targeting a career in the industry, well, you're going to want to pass regulations and implement regulations and create an institutional culture that does not compromise the activities that you're planning on carrying out in the future. General Electric, another example of a single company that's had tremendous presence at the highest levels of government for decades now. Social networking sites, too, more recently, have had a presence in administrations from Bush and Clinton through Obama and in the present as well. And I don't know if some of you may have seen a video I guess it was maybe 6 months ago, of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez grilling Mark Zuckerberg. But this is one of those cases where we have the legislative branch trying to take to task, in some measure, folks that are appointed in the executive. And under the Trump presidency, we've seen certainly a lot more of this, and perhaps even more of it in the environmental sector as well. Pharmaceuticals, another example of this. Firms like Pfizer, Merck, others have had a pronounced presence across administrations. Monsanto, a single company with a huge stake in agribusiness and pesticides, has had dominant positions across branches of government, right? So they've had people, consultants for Monsanto have moved into Congress, and other people that have worked for Monsanto at senior levels have gone on to work in senior positions in multiple executive administrations. So this is very troubling, that we have this massive overlap between the regulator and the industry. It's just a team of foxes guarding the hen house, so to speak. So another tool that you can actually use to track this stuff is whorulеsamerica.ucsc.edu. Bill Domhoff is a sociologist who keeps track of how people move between industry and government, that keeps track of the so-called power elite, as he terms them, and how they relate to each other and how they move through this so-called kind of proverbial revolving door. There are solutions. There are ways that we can imagine this not happening. Transparency International released a report describing how this is a global problem, but it's also a big problem in the United States in particular. Other countries actually do have regulations that limit how possible this is, that make it illegal for people to come back into industry from a regulatory position, either for a certain amount of time or forever. In principle, bans like that could be instituted. But as it stands, there's a lot of political barriers to implementing that. But it's something that you, as an active agent of political action in the world, could advocate for and organize for. Because these are groups that spend a tremendous amount of money, that have a ton of lobbying money. They employ a lot of people to advance their agendas through think tanks, through direct advocacy to legislators, and in consulting directly to agencies that are supposed to regulate, right? And lobbying in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the fact that these industries have so much money and so much influence makes it really hard to tackle them without people populating the regulatory agencies with power that are truly independent from the influence of these industries. So we talked about inert versus active chemicals, but there's a bunch of other terms that I think are worth paying attention to that Valianatos mentions as well. Inert versus active, seemingly a technical distinction, but it's actually quite political. Safe versus unsafe. If something is classified as safe, the implication is that any quantity of it is basically safe. But in fact, there are some chemicals that are unsafe at any level. Tested versus untested. There's so many untested compounds that we just don't know the impacts of, that we won't know the impacts of for a really long time. And I just think it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of these matters are decided through political processes, through legislation. And what that means is that you can actually act to try to exert influence and try to organize around expanding the remit of regulatory agencies. It's challenging, but I think right now we're in a moment where those kinds of big changes could actually become possible in kind of the medium-term future. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of rollbacks right now. The Clean Power Plan is under threat. Fuel standards are under threat. Major rollbacks have already been initiated under the Trump administration. Major environmental rules have been rolled back. We read about this on the very first day of class. And that includes air pollution and emissions regulations, drilling and extraction, water pollution, etc. So we're seeing a massive rollback of the already problematic and compromised regulatory agencies. And at the EPA level, Scott Pruitt, the first head of the EPA under Trump, was ultimately dismissed under a cloud of ethics scandals. Now, Pruitt cut his teeth basically suing the EPA as an attorney on behalf of industry. And when he was pushed out, he was replaced by a former coal lobbyist, Andrew Wheeler, right? So the people that are literally in charge of these agencies now come from backgrounds that were deeply oppositional to them, that really sought to see them destroyed or at least gutted as much as possible, to become essentially permitting agencies and rubber stampers for industry. All right. This is a global phenomenon again, and the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, recently came out with a report that found that despite a 38-fold increase in environmental laws put in place since 1972, one of the biggest challenges for environmental governance is the failure to implement those regulations and enforce them. So it's absolutely critical not only to have good legislation, but to have agencies in the executive branch that are led by people that are committed to actually fulfilling the mission, that are structurally independent from the industries that they seek to regulate, and I think this is critical, populated by staff at all levels that are committed to the mission as well. And, you know, honestly, as an educator, I think that one of the big missions that we have is to train people, to train students today, people like you, to be able to potentially enter these agencies in a time when government is more favorable to environmental governance and regulation, to be able to enact the really visionary and vital agendas of environmental regulation and public health regulation as well. Circling back to our conversation about population and about economic growth, the Kaya identity, about what happens as countries tend to develop. You might think that kind of poor environmental governance is largely the province of places that have fewer resources, former colonies that have struggled to build effective state bureaucracies. And to some extent, this trend is true, that Yale's Environmental Performance Index, which assesses how good environmental regulation is across different countries, does seem to track with GDP per capita. But if you look at that cluster at the top here, where the United States and other wealthy countries are, you'll notice that the United States is basically at the bottom of those countries. And I would reckon that this is actually a lot worse now. / it's worsening every year. Similarly, environmental health and ecosystem vitality, you can see that the United States is at the very bottom again of other European and North American countries, and it's comparable to a lot of countries elsewhere in the world with fewer economic resources, which shows that this is a problem of governance, that this is a problem of politics, and it's not just a problem of resources, but rather how those resources are allocated. All right. So I'll just close with a brief, incomplete, because it's a really beautiful, inspiring, I think, story. Little vignette about this coal plant in Chicago, the Fisk generating station. So a group of activists, and I know some of them, many of whom are associated with an organization called Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, worked in the 2000s to get this plant shut down. And what that really involved doing was navigating a lot of these bureaucracies, understanding the regulatory environment, being well informed about the policy details that they were dealing with, and ultimately trying to leverage power at the local level by influencing city council members. And through a combination of direct action, protests, rallies around the plant, knocking on doors and getting people in the neighborhood to turn out to meetings to understand that this power plant was actually connected intimately with the health issues that they were facing in their neighborhood, by going to the city council members that were unwilling to regulate against the zoning permits and the renewal permits for this plant. They managed to flip just enough city council members in Chicago, this is about 8 years ago now, to oppose the sustained operation of this plant. And this was a major win for a largely Hispanic community on Chicago's southwest side that had lacked access to political power for a long time. And one of the key kind of things that I think this event drove home for me is that people that are living in marginalized positions, when they see, and when in this case they saw, and people that I know saw, that there were direct health impacts of a coal plant on their community, they were able to not only organize to shut down that acute thing, but also connect the issues that they were facing right there in their neighborhood with issues around global climate change. And this is something that I think has tremendous power. It can seem like the entire regulatory apparatus is, slanted in favor of industry, and there's a lot of evidence that that's true. But at the same time, given the unequal burdens that pollution has on poor people, on communities of color, given that these types of issues really hit home for people, it also provides one of the most important and I think kind of vital spaces for people to really come together and organize for a new type of environmental politics. Even right here in the Pioneer Valley, we see examples of this. We see gas leaks from the now bought out gas company that has been bought by Eversource, concentrated in areas that have a lot more people of color. And what that has led to right here in the Pioneer Valley, and I know that you all have dispersed now, is organizing, is people in Springfield talking to each other, talking to their neighbors about the need for environmental regulation and climate policy. It's also international. This is another image of a protest in Peru recently, directly coming out of the impacts of a large mine in terms of environmental health and pollution. And what this does, I think, is builds people's experiences of pollution, of the failures of the state to protect them in their neighborhood, to demand better of their leaders, and to also think not only about what's happening in their neighborhood, but how it connects to bigger issues around climate change. And so I think that even though pollution and regulation has been really challenging in the United States and globally, it is an absolutely essential space for drawing connections between the local and the global. And I look forward to discussing more of this with you all, or some of you all, on Thursday. All right. Happy quarantining insofar as such a thing is possible, and continue to be well.